Good evening from Gateshead Archive at home. And this evening we welcome Anthea Lang for a talk about Saltwell Park through the years. Good evening from Gateshead Archive at home. And this evening we welcome Anthea Lang for a talk about Saltwell Park through
Hello everyone. Lucy, I don't like it when I can't see you. I get very worried.
Well, I'm still here. I was just turning off my other device because it was starting to speak out the same thing and we were going to end up in a continuous feedback loop for a really long time there. Anyway, I've managed to shut the other one up. So I'm really sorry about that, everybody. You would have thought I'd have nailed this by now, wouldn't you?
Actually, I let you into a secret. I was doing exactly the same thing.
Well,
this is a good start, isn't it? This is going to be a fun evening.
This is going to be lovely. So this is the last Q&A of this season of Heritage Hour. I think we may have another pre-recorded video next week, but this is the last time that we're going to be up online doing a live broadcast like this for the time being anyway. And we're very much looking forward in September to being able to hold a local history festival, which if you look on our web pages, you'll be able to find some more information about that now. So with regards to the talk this evening, Anthea Lang is a local historian, tour guide and adult education tutor here in Gateshead. And she's going to do a talk this evening about Saltwell Park through the years. As you're listening to the talk and seeing the photos, if you post any questions or comments in the box, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end. And so without further delay, I'll hand over to you properly now, Anthea.
Lovely. Well, welcome everybody. Some of you might have seen a talk I did earlier in the year about the history of Saltwell Park, and I've tried to make this one a little bit different. So this is a sort of chronological look at the park. I will talk a little bit about how it began, and obviously the history is really important, but also I've got a lot of photographs through the years, some of which you may not have seen. And I was just saying to Lucy earlier, if there's anyone on the photographs that you recognise, do get in touch with Gateshead Libraries, because I think all these images are from their stock, and it would be really nice to add some personal information. So anyway, off we go, all being well. And the screen's frozen, but never mind, we'll ignore that. There we go. So our story really begins in 1853, when William Wales, who was a stained glass manufacturer, bought the estate of Saltwell Cottage. And on the land, he built a rather fabulous, bizarre, mad, whatever you want to call it, mansion house. And he surrounded it with a series of castellated walls and turrets. He actually built those first before the house was built. Most people would build a house and then put walls around, but William Wales liked to do things differently. And this is one of the turrets, and I've put this in because this is octagonal shaped. And if you go around the park today, just look around you and you will spot so many buildings and structures that are eight-sided. And this is all the fault of Edward Kemp, who got the job of designing the park. Gateshead Council bought the land and the house. They borrowed £32,000 from the government to do this, and £25,000 of that was paid to William Wales, and the rest they used for landscaping. And Edward Kemp, who had been the superintendent at Birkenhead Park and had done some private work for William Wales at Saltwell, got the job of providing plans for the park He charged 4 guineas a day for this. And what's really, I think, wonderful is the fact that though there have been so many changes to the park over the years, the basic structure of it is still very much Kemp's design. And the reason that it works so well as an area is largely down to Edward Kemp and his vision. And he did have lots of challenges to overcome. The first one was this. Now, this is where the estate gets its name, because on it was a salt well. And William Wales sort of restored this in a sort of very Victorian Gothic way. Called it the salty welly. I always say the salty welly because the words end with E. And put a lovely ornate little decoration at the top, all decorated in black and red. And the nice thing about this is that there are 2 water troughs. The main one was for horses. And that was important because this entrance here, not these gates because they came a little bit later, but this entrance was the entrance to the estate before it was a park. And it's not a good entrance from a park's point of view because it's very narrow and windy. So this was one thing Kemp had to address, but I'll come on to that in a minute. Going back to the well, we've got the horse trough. So the horses pulling the carriages for visitors would need this. But underneath, there's another little trough, and it says, for the good of thirsty doggies, which is really rather sweet. Now, this is what was Saltwell Lane. Saltwell Road South, as we have it today, didn't exist. This didn't go in until the late 1920s. So this was the lane. And when you today go and look at the Saltwell, you have a wall behind you which separates you from the lane. And as you'll see, those gates had to be moved when the lane was obsolete, if you like, and the road was built, but more of that later. So the park opened on the Whit weekend of May 1876. We do not know the exact date. I have trawled through copious records, and all we know is that it's recorded that it opened over the Whit weekend. And these are the main gates, which are at the corner of Avenue Road and where the little theatre is. And they show Gateshead Coat of Arms. And you've got no excuse for getting the date of opening wrong because it tells you opened 1876. Kemp put this entrance here because this is an aerial view of it. When you go through those gates, you're on a decline, so that you have this fabulous view. And in 1876, that view was over to the Ravensworth estates, which were then more landscape. Today, it's basically green fields. But the impression was anyone coming to the park for the first time would think that everything that they could see was the park. And you know, for people who were living in slum conditions in Central Gateshead at the time, this would have been an absolutely fabulous place to come to. The gates themselves were made by a Gateshead company called Bainbridge and Crimson, and they cost £29 when they were put in. Now, when the park opened, it didn't have the lake. That's something else that I'm going to come on to. But Kemp designed this entrance, and walking down, it leads to this, which was the broad walk. It's described as the long walk here. And we know this photograph was taken quite early on in the park's history. The gentleman here is the head gardener. That's Mr. Wilson, and this was his daughter. And it's certainly before 1905. It's probably in the 1890s. But you can see all this lovely carpet bedding. We still have quite an amount of this today. And this was the refreshment pavilion, because you needed a refreshment pavilion when people came to the park. They needed this. there wasn't a lot in the way of facilities. This wasn't added until 1881, so it wasn't here when the park opened. There were, however, toilets, there were earth closets. They were seen as essential. And in 1880, a rather coyly named Chalet de Nécessité was opened, which cost a penny to use. But those toilets can't have been very good, because in 1909 they were all condemned and replaced. So the idea of the Broad Walk was this was where you promenaded. Young ladies and their beaux would walk along here. Not without incident. There were frequent reports of young men making lewd comments about young ladies, and sometimes they had to put an extra policeman on duty in the park because of this. This was one of the first things that went into the park. This was the George Charlton Memorial Fountain. George Charlton was Mayor of Gateshead when the park was being planned, and this is directly opposite Saltwell Towers. So William Wales must have got a bit of a shock, I think, one morning. He was allowed to live for a rent of £120 a year in the towers, and maybe the first time he really got the sense that the area was changing was when he drew his bedroom curtains and discovered workmen constructing this drinking fountain. Now, the only problem with drinking fountains in the park was that the water supply was pathetic, and it wasn't very long before you could only get water from this on 2 or 3 days a week. So I have to say it wasn't wonderful. Now, this area became, Kemp turned this into the Octagonal bowling green. Octagonal. It was a lawned area under William Wales, and what you can see in the background is one of the aviaries. There are 2 aviaries today. You could do a whole talk on the animals and the birds in the park, because there were all sorts of things that went wrong with them. There was no original plan to have any livestock in the park at all. But when the park opened, it had 3 swans, 47 ducks, 4 peacocks, 1 peahen, 8 pheasants, 3 hens, 1 bantam cock, and a bantam hen. But that was expanded by the addition of monkeys, 2 stags, a little owl, and things were always going wrong. One stag got loose and gored a visitor, and Gateshead Council got sued. And then they decided that there should be no more dangerous animals kept in the park. And the monkeys would not behave. The monkeys were terrible. And Victorian mothers were very worried that their daughters were being affected by the displays of affection by the monkeys. And so they were banished to the island in the lake when the lake was built. But it took quite a while for that decision to be made. And whilst the committee were deliberating, they used to cover the monkeys' cages on a Sunday. So, you know, I just leave that thought with you. And this was one of William Wales's own features. He had installed this maze for the benefit of his young relatives, bringing a whole new meaning to the phrase "get lost." But it was improved by Edward Kemp, and it's had various changes over the years, but it's always been a very popular part of the park. And perhaps the reason that Wales bought the estate in the first place was because it had a dean running through it. And this was a very fashionable thing. All Victorian gentlemen wanted to have a dean in their properties, and William Wales was no exception. Kemp improved it. He widened the paths, and he added bridges, which were largely wooden. He didn't want wooden bridges, he wanted metal bridges, but Gateshead Council didn't want the expense of doing that. When the park opened, there were a lot of unofficial rules and regulations. One of them was that you could not bring your drugget into the park to be beaten. And if you don't know what a drugget was, it was a carpet. So can you imagine, you know, pumping a carpet to Saltwell Park to beat it? Anyway, you weren't allowed to do that. But more controversially, you weren't allowed to bring any wheeled vehicle into the park, and that included prams. And there was an absolute outroar, and that had to change. But in 1887, we got these official regulations. So wheeled vehicles were allowed, but you couldn't ride them. So if you had a bicycle, you could push it, but you still couldn't beat your drugget. Now the lake was added in 1880. It was designed by a sort of consortium. John Hancock of the Hancock Museum, James Bower, who was the Gateshead's borough engineer, who was responsible for the buildings in the park actually getting constructed, and he designed them. And William Wales is supposed to have put forward a plan for the island. And there were some very flimsy railings put around the pond, and you'll see more of these later. And there's some of the livestock having a nice little swim. On the Broadwalk, you have two shelter houses, and these are the original plans for these. These were designed by James Bower, and they were modelled on similar shelter houses in Chelsea, where he came from. And they've always been quite effective. They've been considerably improved under the restoration that was done 20 years ago. And there's what one of them looks like today, Octagonal. Now you've got to have a park keeper. We don't have a park keeper today, but until a few years ago, we always did. And this was the park keeper's house. This was designed by James Bower, and originally single story. This top story was added in 1891. So it's a very nice house, very sympathetically designed, as all Bower's buildings are, to sort of complement the towers. Now, William Wales died in 1881, and the house was then up for rent. Gateshead Council obviously owned it. The problem with it was not very well planned. It wasn't well constructed. It was actually built without any foundations. And tenants were hard to come by. So every tenant who moved in from 1881 always had certain demands before they would accept the tenancy. And the first tenant after William Wales was a chap called Hugh Clayton Armstrong, who was a wallpaper and brown paper manufacturer. And he wanted a house for his butler and a stable. So this was the East Lodge. This was built in 1881, and it cost £378, 5 shillings and 10 pence. And it's very similar brick to Saltwater Towers. And these are the stables that Hugh Clayton Armstrong wanted. And again, the design is very sympathetic to the towers. And of course, here you have the bell that was rung for the park closing. And then this West Lodge is built at the Saltwell Lane end of the park. And this was rented to Gateshead's Watch Committee. So this was for a policeman who would live here and would patrol the park and look after it. But only on condition that the rent was 5 shillings. But the policeman's wife had to look after the entrance gates. That was the condition of the 5 shilling a week rent. And all these properties are still here today. Now, these are the most grandiose gates in the park. These came from the Paris Exposition of 1878, but made by Gateside's Bainbridge and Crimson, who had done the main entrance gates, and they got a bronze medal. And Bainbridge and Crimson offered them to the park after the Exposition ended, and they were installed in 1885. But this isn't their original position, of course, because originally they were beside the Saltwell, but now we've got Saltwell Road South constructed, so they were moved up together with their pillars. Now we're back to the Broadwalk because we have two subtle changes. We're now up to about 1905. The first change is the Lucas Memorial, which was added in 1903 to commemorate the life of Alderman John Lucas, who had been Mayor of Gateshead, head of the Education Committee. It's the only statue to a person in the park. And the Almond Pavilion, octagonal, had its design slightly marred by the addition of this clock, given by Mr. Almond, who was another, like Hugh Clayton Armstrong, wallpaper manufacturer. And from this date, it became known as the Almond Pavilion. It wasn't the Almond Pavilion until 1905. And here's another view of it. And you can see we now have prams, or perambulators as they're called, on the Broadwalk. And we have a lovely view here of the bandstand. This is the second bandstand. The first bandstand was built near the towers, and it was made of wood and it rotted very quickly. Besides which, tenants complained that the music was too loud. So it was moved to an area between the lake and the Almond Pavilion. And it was very smart. It was a nice bandstand, and you can see running around it, you've got a cement asphalt path, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. You've also got boats. Boats were added to the park not long after the lake opened in 1880. And here we have the little boathouse. This was the original boathouse. This isn't what we have today, but this came from the industrial exhibition, which was held in Newcastle on what we now know as Exhibition Park. That's why it's called Exhibition Park, to commemorate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887. And two buildings came from the that exhibition. This was one of them. It cost £10, and this was the ticket office for the boats. Some of the boats were made by Palmer's of Jarrow. They produced them in 1896, but there was quite a variety of boats used on the lake. This has to be one of the most miserable photographs taken in the park, and it shows a Band of Hope outing in the early 1900s, and there isn't one soul on that photograph who is smiling. The sort of least miserable is this young boy here, but goodness knows, maybe they've walked for miles and they're just absolutely worn out, but even their leader doesn't look very happy. So not a very happy group, but that's the Band of Hope for you. And these are some of the bridges. These are the wooden bridges that were constructed. All the bridges in the Dean today are replicas. They were all done under the restoration, because these had all fallen into disuse. A horse put its foot through one of them within a few years of them being built. So they weren't very strong, and I think you would get that impression by looking at them. Now, this is a very grand building. This became known as the Indo-Chinese Pavilion, And this had come from the exhibition park. Gateshead Council bought this the same time as they bought the ticket office. This cost £50, together with £150 for its removal and re-erection. And this had been used on Exhibition Park as a cafe run by Lions. And it was actually, Lions had never run cafes before. This was the forerunner of the Lions Corner House series of cafes. And this remained in the park until 1958, when it was demolished. It was a lovely building, but it wasn't built to last. And apparently there were lots of rats used to occupy this building. So while it was meant to be a refreshment pavilion, it was usually just used to store the boats during the winter. These are some of the least successful boats that were added to the lake. These are the canoes, and they were removed in 1891, and they were described as a failure, largely because people didn't know how to paddle in them properly, so they were always capsizing and people had to be rescued. And you can see the bandstand again, which leads us on to this. This is just a list of some of the bands who played during April to September 1898. So we've got Gateshead Borough Band, we've got Heworth Colliery Brass Band, we've got the Railway Servants, we've got Windy Nook Temperance Brass Band. So all these bands used to come, they would apply to perform on a Sunday afternoon. This is probably the busiest the park ever was. This is taken in June 1897. It's the occasion of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. And in the park that day were 12,000 children who were all given a special Jubilee medal, and 30,000 adults. And there was a religious service followed by brass bands and entertainment. Recreation was an important part of the park. And we saw earlier the octagonal bowling green, but other bowling greens were added. By the Second World War, there were 6 bowling greens in the park. But this is the largest and the grandest, and you can see the Indo-Chinese pavilion in the background. This was added in 1901, and this cost £385. And if you want a little mission, if you want a little game, if you go to the park and you look at these stairs here, one of them does have the date on it. It takes quite a bit of looking for, but that's a little challenge that you can do. And here it is in use. This is a few years later. So that pavilion really does make a statement, doesn't it? Now, the Boer War Memorial was added in 1905, and this commemorates 77 men of Gateshead who died during the Second Boer War. And it has the Angel of Peace at the top, and all the men's names are inscribed under the company under which they served. And this was unveiled on a day which is now very auspicious, 11th of November. But in 1905, the 11th of November didn't signify anything. So it's a really interesting coincidence. There were 1,000 troops on parade, and General Sir John French, who later commanded the British Expeditionary Force in the First World War, unveiled the statue. Now, here we are with another look, looking towards the lake at the bandstand, and I've put this in for a reason. This is the second bandstand in its second position. Bandstands move around the park throughout its history, but people kept, as they wanted to, walking around the bandstand. And so the council put this path around, which we saw earlier, but people persisted. They didn't want to walk on an asphalt path. They wanted to walk on the grass. And the grass around the bandstand just got worn away. So the council got very exasperated about this and thought, where can we put the bandstand where nobody will walk around it? And their solution was to put it on the island on the lake. And of course, the problem with this is that all the musicians had to be rowed out, and you can see the boats there. So they've all been transported on those boats, and they had to play. They had to put a sort of windshield up because obviously it got quite windy on that island. There were huge problems because, of course, if the wind was in the wrong direction, nobody could hear the band, and bands used to ask if, please, we don't want to play on the island. Can we bring our portable bandstand? And they were always refused permission to do this. So this remained on the island from 1909 until 1920. And there it is on this photograph. Now, I put this photograph in because this shows the little steamboat, the John Mccoy. This was bought in 1909. It cost £68, but it really made its money because in its first month, it carried 24,151 passengers. And it was named after John Mccoy, who became Mayor of Gateshead 8 times and is the only Gateshead mayor to have been knighted. Now, these bridges, which are over what was Wales Ha, which separated the areas immediately around the towers from the surrounding sort of fields, these were added in 1913. There was a wood one and a stone one. And this one cost £21, 12 shillings when it opened. And there's something very special about this bridge, but I'm not going to mention this at the moment. And you can see the towers there. We think it might be the photographer's little girl on this photograph. And here's the lake. Now, children did used to fall in with monotonous regularity. And so they erected some railings, but the railings didn't go all around the park, so they weren't always very effective. And also you can see the paddling pool, which was added in 1925, that little paddling pool there. And you can see the swings. And here's another view of the swings. These were put here in 1920. You can see the bandstand still on the lake there. But poor children could not play on swings or any other kind of equipment designed for them on a Sunday. Sunday was a holy day, so they were all covered up and you couldn't use them. Now, in 1920, Gateshead Council bought an addition to the park. This was the Grove Estate. This is the house. This is owned by Gateshead Council, but it's not part of the park. This is outside the park boundary. But they relocated the bandstand to the Grove in 1921 when it opened. It opened on the 12th of May, 1921. The council were going to charge an admittance fee into the Grove area, but they never did. It was always free. But you could pay for a deck chair to listen to the bands performing. The putting green, which is no more, it's a shame. I think we could have a nice putting green today. That was installed in 1922. It was designed by a golf professional, so it was a good putting green. And then in 1928 onwards, we have the construction of Saltwell Road South. And so this is how the Saltwell looks. So the gates that were there were in the road position up here, which is where they are today. And that was the policeman's house, which we've already talked about. If you look at the inscription in the well, there's definitely a spelling mistake. There's the word thrist written, which is thirst. The sculptor got the R and the I in the in the wrong places. It's quite an interesting text to read. It's from the Gospel of St. John. And here's another view. You can clearly see the paddling pool, 1925, and you've got the swings and you've got other play equipment. You can see the slide, which I'm going to talk about next. And here we've got the start of Lobley Hill, and you can see all the fields up here. This is the slide. It was added in 1931. It cost £35 and it was constructed of steel and birch. And that's what you slid down the birch. So the photographer has posed a whole group of children climbing. And whether he's instructed one to slide down or whether one's just decided to slide down is anybody's guess. But look at the old-fashioned pram. I think that's just wonderful. But of course, there's no sort of child-friendly surface. If you fell off that slide, you hurt yourself. Now, Saltwell Towers has had a variety of tenants, but the last one had moved out in 1922. And they couldn't get anyone else to take it over. So in 1933, they opened the building as the local and industrial museum, and it was meant to focus very much on Gateshead, but it ended up with an eclectic collection of all sorts of things from all over the place. People just gave anything that they had, and largely whatever they gave was kept. But some things were added later. The shop front was added in 1940, and this was an actual shop front. It was taken from Grahamsley Street, which is just off the High Street. The council had a terrible job fixing it because it was quite fragile. And inside was the display was dating from 1906 with 1906 prices. So you have eggs, 18 for a shilling, and the box of sweets there is described as Nougat de la Reine, and you've got a 6-penny packet of cigarettes here. And about the same time, this room was donated by the Dodd sisters, who went on to found the Little Theatre. This was furniture that had come from Ashfield, where their aunts had lived, the Mrs. Mawson. And when they died, they moved some of the furniture into Saltwell Towers. Sadly, the towers sort of came to a sad end as an industrial museum, because in 1969, the floor gave way due to rot, and all the exhibits were hastily transferred to the Shipley, but not really catalogued at the time. But if you go into the Shipley Gallery today, there's a nice exhibition of some of those exhibits from the museum. Here's another view of the Boer War Memorial, and I just put this in to show you how different the approach was. Today it's all grass. We have the flower bed around the memorial, but we don't have borders like this anymore, and this is rather nice. It certainly makes a statement. This is George V's Silver Jubilee, the Mayoress, Mrs. Armstrong. That's her husband here, Timothy, in the tricorn. And this is Sir John Mccoy, is planting an oak tree at the south end of the Broad Walk. People were always planting trees, but not all of them survived. There were a few open air drafts boards in the park. This is one of them. There were 6 by 1950, but we don't have any at all today. And this photograph dates from 1938, and it's a match between the mayors of Gateshead on the right, Mr. Pickering, and of South Shields. So you've got a variety of council officials and other people watching progress. And here's a bowls match on the main bowling on the main bowling green, and you can see how many people used to watch bowls. It was a really, really popular sport. And these are the tennis courts. These were there were some older ones put in the park in 1885, but these ones date from 1923. And one lady got removed by the police because it was thought that her tennis skirt was a little too short for decency's sake. By the 1930s, this is what the Dean looked like. So you've got a real rockery going on here, and you can see the greenhouses. We don't have the greenhouses today. And we've got two young men having a stroll, or maybe they're council employees inspecting. Who knows? This is a school party from Calvin Grove School, and they are looking at a display of chrysanthemums in the greenhouses. And of course, the council grew all the flowers that were put into the park. When this photograph was taken, the park keeper, the head gardening superintendent, was a chap called Angus McBean. And Angus McBean was responsible for creating the Rose Garden, which opened in July 1936. And interestingly, no work on this garden was done by employees of Gateshead Council. This was all done by unemployed labour, and it was a special unemployed scheme. There were a lot of these up and down the country, where the government would give funding to councils to employ unemployed men, to get them a little bit of a wage, and get them off the means test. And of course, we still have the Rose Garden today. And this is a bowls tournament. This is 1939, and we've got the Mayor Pickering, with the bowls. And this gentleman here was Gateshead's MP, Mr. Tom Magnay. And it looks a rather damp day. Quite a few are in their mucks. Now, people knew by the late 1930s that war was approaching, and up and down the country, air raid shelters were constructed. And this one, which could house 648 people, was added to the park, just opposite West Park Road. You can see the houses there. Further up in Saltwell View, further up is the little theatre. And you needed a large shelter in the park because most of these houses, although they're lovely houses, didn't have gardens big enough to put an Anderson shelter in. So that's the reason this was so big. But of course, Gateshead hardly had any bomb damage in the Second World War. Ironically, the only stick of bombs that actually fell in the park on the night of the 3rd and 4th of May, 1941. And they damaged all the windows in Saltwell View, all the houses. They were blown out. The little theatre hadn't opened at this point, but the door was badly damaged. And you've got a commemorative photograph there of the exploded bomb. In 1942, 1943, 1944, we had a project called Holidays at Home. This was a government initiative. People were encouraged not to travel during wartime for a holiday. The government wanted the trains used for servicemen to move them about the country, not for people going on holidays. So a Holidays at Home scheme was devised. And as I say, this took place in Saltwater Park over 3 consecutive days. And these are a couple of stills from a cine film which was taken at the time, a colour film, by a Gateshead policeman. And there were all sorts of things happening. There were dances, there were competitions. This is a basketball or netball competition, games, sports, and they were hugely popular. They took place usually in the June and the August, 1 week in each. This is the paddling pool frozen over, and as you can see, some boys in the 1940s are enjoying having a little skate. That ice could have given way at any time. So moving to the 50s, 60s and 70s, here's the rose garden in the 1950s, looking very verdant. And here's a nice picture of the Broadwalk. This is the 1960s. You might recognize somebody on here. That would be nice if you did. And this one again. People always have had their favorite benches on the Broadwalk and in the park. And here's the Octagonal bowling green, but now it's used as what was described as the kiddies play area. This was for the little ones. But you can see one of the aviaries there. That was used. I mean, today we've got all sorts of things in the aviaries. We've got guinea pigs, we've got rabbits, we've got peacocks, hens. But one of the inhabitants was this. This is the story of Whitey the cockatoo. Whitey was born in, we think, the late 1880s. Cockatoos do live to a good age. Apparently, it was a rather vicious bird. And in 1973, it fell off its perch dead. And the Parks Committee decided that as this had been a much loved bird, it would be a really good idea to have it stuffed. So they asked the Hancock Museum, but all the taxidermists were on holiday and nothing could be done. So of course, as committees do, they dithered a bit. Where could they send it to be stuffed? And in the meantime, the bird began to decompose. So they hurriedly asked the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, please could the bird go into their morgue to keep it chilled? Well, the QE weren't very keen on that idea. And eventually a lady came forward who had a spare freezer. Now, this is in 1973. Most people didn't have a freezer, never mind a spare freezer. So the bird was put in the freezer and it stopped it decomposing anymore. Then it went to Doncaster. It was stuffed in Doncaster and it came back to the Shipley Gallery. And this is a photograph of it in situ in the gallery, in the curator's office. Poor soul, having to sit with a stuffed cockatoo. And this little girl was photographed with her, with the cockatoo. Incidentally, we don't know where that cockatoo is today. He's gone. This was the pedalows that were added. This is a photograph in the 1970s in the lake. There have been a wide variety of boats used over the years. And by now, the boathouse is a brick pavilion. That's not the original one that we paid £10 for. We don't have this pavilion anymore. This was built in the late 1960s, and it's the George Wilkes Pavilion. George Wilkes had a music shop on Gateshead High Street. This was a problematic building because, as you can see, it has an awful lot of glass. And when it was constructed, it was decided that it didn't need any heating because the sunlight would go through the glass and would warm the building, which is fine if you get a lot of sunlight, but if you don't get a lot of sunlight, that building was freezing cold. So that, we don't have that anymore. That disappeared, that was dismantled. As was this was the Cube. In 1976, Gateshead Council decided to donate our bandstand to Beamish Museum, which was just in its very early days. And we then got this monstrosity, really, which was a bandstand and refreshment pavilion combined, known as the Cube. This lasted from 1976, but it was removed in 1991. And here is something that many people will remember, the aeroplane. This came from Lambton Lion Park in 1982. It was actually two planes that were joined together. It had its wings truncated. It couldn't possibly have flown. But this was hugely popular. In the first year, 22,299 people visited this aeroplane. And this disappeared when the park was being renovated. This was added in 1981. This is a war memorial to 1,419 officers and men of the DLI who were killed between 1900 and 1945. And it replaces a memorial that was in St. Mary's Church, but was destroyed when the church had a serious fire in 1979. The plaque in the middle, it says AD 1886, that was taken from the Gateshead's drill hall in Burt Terrace. And you can see it says 5th Durham Rifles. Behind it is a secret, it's consecrated ground, and there are a few soldiers commemorated there, but on the benches you've got the badges of the DLI. Now, the park was in a sorry state by the late 1990s, and there was a huge restoration programme undertaken between 1999 and 2003, cost £10 million, money provided by Gateshead Council with substantial heritage lottery funding. As part of it, the towers was literally taken apart and rebuilt brick by brick. And the lake was dredged, and it looks really nice there. And we have some new boats. We've got different boats today. Again, the boats keep changing. So we've got swans there, and we've got Loch Ness monsters. And these are the model boats. Once the lake was put in, we had a model yacht club, which began in 1886, but that was replaced by the model boat club in 2002. And these are some of the boats that they still use today. The Saltwell was restored, and you can see there's the Ye Good of Thirsty Dogs around there. And we got new litter bins, which are octagonal shape. These were built, you've got the date 2002. There were no waste baskets in the park until 1897. But I like the fact that these are octagonal, they go. And here's the towers restored, and this is the back of it. The bricks were in such poor condition that they literally ran out of them. They couldn't use them all, which is why you've got a sort of very modern looking bit at the back. And inside it's very open plan, so you've got a cafe inside, and upstairs there's an exhibition area, but at least we still do have the building. And there's another view of it, and you've got the sunken garden here, and Wales's Arboretum here. The Dean was all smartened up. All the bridges were replaced. They were all new. And the maze was replanted as well with metal struts, so that children couldn't just run through. It's quite big, the maze today, when you look at it. So you could quite easily get lost. In 2006, we had a sculpture trail installed in the park, and these are some, not all the sculptures remain, but this one does today. This is still there. And in 2010, Gateshead's entry for the Chelsea Flower Show was added, and this represents the plants represent runners in the Great North Run, and it's really very nice. It's just been replanted. In 2011, we saw the Japanese Friendship Garden. This celebrated 20 years of friendship between Gateshead and Komatsu in Japan. And for the last few years, we've had a Field of Remembrance, which is opened in November, commemorating, anyone can put a cross there for any soldier or sailor who's died in conflict. And to sort of mirror that, we've got the Garden of Reflection, which opened in 2015, which commemorates two soldiers, Rifleman Mark Turner and Corporal Stephen Dunn. And the plaques were produced by Mark's uncle. And there's an area of planting around it, which was all done by Thrive, which is the organisation to support mental health in soldiers who are no longer active in the armed forces. And then the very latest thing that's been added is the Buzzing Garden, which is a collaboration between West Sweden and the National Garden Scheme Northeast. And this commemorates various aspects of landscape, coastline, the countryside. The red pergolas, that red is the colour of a traditional Swedish house, and it's got a little lake, and it's really it's a nice little addition to the park. And with that, we come to the end. But if you're still with me, I do have a question. We've looked at quite a few war memorials in the park, but there is another one which is cunningly concealed. And if anyone wants to have a little guess as to where that is, do so, and I can tell you if you are right. So thank you all very much for listening, and it's over to you, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Anthea. That was absolutely lovely to see all of those fantastic images that you've found and hear a bit more about different developments in the park, all those different forms of entertainment. So the aeroplane did come up in our comments quite promptly. Thank you, Gemma. That was really nice to hear your memories there. Now I'm just looking for the comments. Where have they gone? Yes, so Gemma says, Saltwell Park was famously known when I was a kid for the aeroplane. And Lee has given a few little bits of information, in fact, just echoing what you've said about it, from the Lambton Lion Park. So, I mean, you know, there's pretty much a one-off, really, having an aeroplane in the park, surely.
Yes, I don't think many parks had an aeroplane.
So that's obviously something very memorable for people. And just while I give you a chance to put any more questions or memories, or if you've, like Anthea's asked, if you've recognised anybody, or if you can think of the other war memorial that she's not mentioned yet. Just in the meantime, Anthea, are there any listed buildings in the park?
There are, actually, and it might surprise you to know that there are 12.
12? I did not realise there were quite 12 buildings, to be honest.
There are, well, 12 structures are listed. So the Belvedere walls, the turrets and the staircases, Saltwell Towers itself, the George Charlton drinking fountain, the Broadwalk, the aviaries, the stable block, the Parkkeeper's house, the shelters on the Broadwalk, Alderman Lucas statue, and the South African War Memorial are all listed by English Heritage as Grade 2.
So do you think that the fact that it's listed, I mean, I don't know if this will have come into, obviously, back in the late 90s when they were trying to decide what to do with Saltwell Towers, did that kind of, you know, mean that they really did have an imperative to restore it? I mean, when you talked about them rebuilding it brick by brick, it seems, you know, obviously it's a wonderful building, it's wonderfully wacky and individual, and, you know, there'd never be anything like. But, you know, you also mentioned the budget, which was astronomical.
Yeah, yes. I think what you've got to realise is that Saltwell Towers wasn't listed until I think about the 1970s, and it was under threat of demolition 2 or 3 times before then. So it was really imperative that it got listed, because then its future was safe. But I mean, I moved to Gateshead in 1985, and then it was all railed off, and there was a tree growing through the roof of the towers then.
Right.
You know, it was like Sleeping Beauty's castle, you know, just waiting to be woken up.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that now, isn't it? Because it is all, you know, very high, very functioning and you know, a useful space with the cafe and everything. It's it's all very functional now. So it's kind of hard for me to imagine a bit more of a recent comer to Gateshead. To imagine what it would have been like with overgrowth. So you've mentioned quite a few buildings there. Do you have a favourite building in the park, Anthea?
Well, yes, I do, I think. It's a toss-up between the East Lodge and the West Lodge. I think both of those today are lovely buildings. The West Lodge is so pretty. It's all planted with flowers, and it just always looks absolutely gorgeous. And the East Lodge is very stylish, so I think I like both of those. The Towers is completely mad, you know, but you couldn't live in the Towers. But I'd quite like to live in the East or the West Lodge. You know, I think they're quite nice buildings.
Lovely. And can you tell us why we don't know the exact date that the park opened? Then you mentioned that there was some...
I wrote it down. It's absolutely ridiculous. I have been through every set of minutes from the Parks Committee. I have been through newspapers. Newspapers only record that the park opened sometime, this is what they say, sometime over the Whit weekend. So I don't think there was an official opening. I think they literally just opened the gates and let people in.
So there mustn't have been any kind of event with a ribbon that got cut or anything like that.
It's really interesting.
But obviously it would have been a really big deal for people nearby to have that opportunity to go and spend time in a green space.
Oh yes, but of course what you've got to remember is when it opened, there was hardly any buildings in that area. They were planned, but they weren't there.
Oh, right, I see.
So everybody who came to that park in the early days had to travel, quite a considerable distance, which is why it was really important to have the drinking fountains.
Right, it's hard for me to imagine that. So the park happened before the houses.
Yes, they were planned, but they weren't built. They started building them in the 1880s.
And I liked seeing the photograph that you showed, which had Lobley Hill kind of just developing.
Yes.
So when would that have been?
Well, that would have been the early 30s. Lobley Hill is a very 1930s development.
Right. And then up until
and then of course you've got the Team Valley as well. The two almost go, hand in hand.
I see. That's lovely. So we have another comment from Gemma. So interesting. My favourite talk of the season. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Gemma. That's lovely.
So we might not be all there with the numbers this evening, because as we were discussing before, there is a number of other sporting fixtures going on at the moment.
It's the quality of the attendees. That's what I always say.
Exactly. And obviously, how much people have enjoyed it. So
has nobody guessed the answer to my question?
Oh, hang on a minute. There's a few more. Yes, we do. Lynn, the bridge is a memorial.
Absolutely, yes. I'll just go back into share screen. Yes, that bridge there is, I'll just get a close-up of it. There we are. It's the Prima Bridge. It commemorates an action in Sicily in the Second World War. Originally, there was a plaque to commemorate this actually on the stone walls on the other side over here. and that was removed. And when the bridge was renewed, they put the lettering on the bridge. It's not as clear now. It's faded quite a bit, so many people miss it. But that is the other war memorial in the park.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Lynn, for putting that in, and well done. You know your part. And then we've got a message from Lee. Fish species in the lake.
Oh, yeah.
There's
well,
pike, perch, stickleback.
Yes. Well, there was the killer pike, of course. There's a whole, as I say, you could do a whole talk on the animals and the birds that have been in the park. But the pike terrorized other fish and people, and there are all sorts of remedies to try and get rid of it. But eventually, I think it was just killed.
Well, Lee mentions pike over 10 pounds in weight have been caught.
Yeah.
So maybe that's that. And I've got another message from Joan, Prima footbridge. So clearly people do know about this.
Yes.
Even though the lettering might be faded, but people can.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
And Lee asks, was anything of interest found when the lake was drained?
Oh, it'd be lovely to say that there was, an unexploded bomb would be good, or weaponry or something. But I don't know that it was recorded, and I've never seen anything about it. I think they found the usual things, children's dummies and, sunglasses and items of clothing.
So with
talking about children, one thing I didn't mention, which we haven't had for years, but there always used to be a feature on sort of bank holidays of the lost children's tent.
Oh.
So you could go and claim a child. You didn't have to claim your own. You could claim any child. But yes, that always amuses me, the lost children's tent. So if you were lost, that's where you went, and you were retrieved, hopefully, before
eventually.
The park closed.
So with regard back to the lake again, so that wasn't there to begin with.
No,
that was
planned. It was planned,
right?
But it wasn't there. It had to be constructed.
And the lake was popular back in the day.
Oh yes, very. I mean, they used to in the winter, in the early winters, for the first few years, they used to allow skating in the winter, and they would charge for it, and that money paid for the asphalting of all the paths in the park. But then I think they got worried that, or maybe there were accidents, and they stopped that. But it did, the revenue did pay for some of the original sort of path coverings.
Fabulous. So we've got another person who knows about the Prima Bridge, which is Roger. So thank you. And then Lee has mentioned in 2001, when the lake was refilled, Northumbrian Water donated 4 million gallons of water.
Well, it would need a few million gallons. It always used to dry up in the early days, and the park superintendent was always begging for money from the Parks Committee to buy some water.
Right. I didn't realise.
But they did a huge cleanup of the lake in the restoration.
So I wonder if they still have to refill it occasionally.
I don't know. I think there's probably enough in there now. So there's quite a wide variety of bird species get in there, So
yeah, so it's a very much a living body of water, isn't it?
Yeah.
So Roger has commented the East Lodge costing about £300 sounds quite pricey. My parents' house, built in 1938, only cost £490, and that was 50 years later.
I know. Our house, prices fluctuate. That was the cost to build, though, not the cost that it was. I don't know if it was sold what that would make. But actually, it was badly built when it was first built, and there was a complaint, and it literally had to be rebuilt again. The contractors were told that the work was shoddy.
Right. But that's the difference between price and cost, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So Lee has said, I've calculated the park area is the size of 42 football pitches.
Well, it's 55 acres. So I don't know if that's 42 football pitches, but I would take Lee's word for it. I'm sure he's right.
And he says that's a lot smaller than Hackney Marshes, which had over 100 in its prime.
Okay.
So thank you for your calculations there, Lee. And Lynn has said, very interesting, thanks. And Lee has said, great info, Anthea. And Joan says, thank you, Anthea. I've done your tour. Must have remembered something.
Yes, well, Newcastle City Guides, in which I am one, we're doing a tour of the park at the end of July. That's a Wednesday evening, and you can book, if you just Google Newcastle City Guides, you'll find all the booking information.
That's lovely. I'm sure a few people who've been watching will love to go along and actually have an in-person tour with you, Anthea. It's been so nice to hear all your different stories and anecdotes, and from the Whitey the cockatoo,
yeah,
to the bowling greens, and just to see how how interested people were in bowling as a spectator sport. It's really hard to imagine that these days, isn't it?
Yeah, but it was very. I mean, it does still have quite a following, but not as much as it did in the sort of 20s and 30s. It was really a popular sport.
Well, that's lovely. Thank you so much, everybody, for all of your really lovely comments there. It's been really interesting to hear your different takes on things. And thank you so much, Anthea, this evening for going through those lovely photos. It's been really fun.
Good. Well, I'm glad you've enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
See you all again soon.